I know a lot of you who watch this channel play the Karo Khan, as I myself do, but I'm really starting to enjoy the King's Indian. If you haven't seen yesterday's video on the King's Indian, crazy game. As in, like, I have no idea. I didn't understand, I don't think, how natural the King's Indian is to play. And I think that's reflected in the game. Okay, my opponent goes d5. I have never ever seen this before. Normally, knight c3 followed by e4 is the way to go. This isn't particularly scary, though. Apparently, it's called an anti-Grunfeld because I suppose if knight c3, black can go for d5, which transposes to the Grunfeld defense, I believe. But d5, I guess we can just say, okay, thank you for opening up the diagonal for our bishop. And if I would argue this is a really easy pawn to target with moves like c6 or e6, but for now, we can just go ahead and castle. There's no threat of e5 just yet. Now there is, so we need to deal with it. I mean, d6 looks perfectly reasonable, and I think we should go ahead and play it. And we have the King's Indian set up now, so we can go from here. And as I was talking about in a recent video I did on the Karo Khan, we have to be flexible with our opening. You know, d5 so early is very strange, but we have to be willing to be flexible and to deal with the situation at hand. So I like the look of the move c5, although maybe c6 or e6 is better because the pawn has already committed itself to the d5 square. Knight d7 is reasonable. E5 is reasonable. Of course, if take en passant, then these pawns kind of suck. I'm thinking e6 is the way to go. And the reason is because if white takes me, I take back with the bishop. And after something like rook e8, we have insane pressure on the e4 pawn. Okay, if take the knight takes and there's pressure on our knight, that's, yeah, fair point from my opponent. However, if take knight takes and something like knight to d7 just defending, I could go for the immediate knight d7, but then if take, the bishop can't take, so perhaps not. I think I'm going to take. There was also something to be said for pawn h6, maybe. Pawn h6, I mean, like, take looks pretty good. Okay, takes back with the c pawn. That is very unexpected. That's very surprising. Because to me, this just seems like a stupidly weak pawn on the e4 square. We could be looking to get our queen out to a5, because we'd be hitting the bishop and pinning this knight, looking for knight e4 and unpinning the knight. So c5 looks very tempting. Just taking space and preparing queen a5. And if take en passant, we can take back with the knight. And d6 is weak. But I think because e4 is so weak, it's a good trade-off. And also, if my opponent takes en passant and we take back and he goes knight to d5, applying pressure to the pinned piece, we always have queen to a5 check getting out of the pin, and then e4 is weak. We have rook e8 applying more pressure. I think we've adapted well to my opponent's quick d5, where basically, normally in the King's Indian, the pawn is back on d4, right? So we'd play something like e5, and then my opponent would go d5, and then the game continues, right? But by my opponent committing to d5 so early, it means that we can immediately go after the pawn with e6. Like, we can force white to open up the center. Normally, when the pawn is on d4 and we go pawn to e5, the point of d5 is to keep the center shut. But by committing to d5 so early, white kind of gives away that idea. Okay, bishop c4 looks very wrong to me. For a start, the bishop doesn't do anything on this square. It's just eating granite, as I'm sure Naroditsky would like to say. But furthermore, it doesn't deal with the problem of queen a5, which, as I'm playing more King's Indian, I'm learning that this queen to a5 move is very, very useful. And yeah, so my opponent goes knight to e2. Why is that a bad move? Why is that a bad move? It should be immediately obvious to you. Knight takes e4. Bishop is hit, knight is hit by 3 different pieces, mind, and we just win a pawn. So Yeah, and after bishop back to d2, I think we should just go ahead and take the bishop, which to me is a very automatic move because 1, we win the bishop pair, but 2, my opponent loses his dark squared bishop, which, as we saw in the previous episode in yesterday's video, when white loses the dark squared bishop like that for a knight, our dark squared bishop becomes stupidly powerful. Quite simply, white has no good way to control the dark squares in the center anymore, and this bishop sucks. It's really bad. So we're up a pawn. I think we should just now reset and figure out what we want to do next. a6, b5 looks interesting, chasing down the bishop. But to be honest, I think maybe it's easier just to put a knight on e5. Like rook e8, yeah, that looks very easy to do. We don't need to do anything insane. We just want to play normal moves. I suppose pawn a6 is probably useful at some point to stop knight to b5 because d6 is weak. But for the time being, if the knight moves, then the queen hangs. So it's okay for now. Okay, let's go knight to e5, hitting the bishop. Looks very powerful. I think the bishop probably wants to go to d7, you know. Correct me if I'm wrong. If any of you play these Benoni-type structures, you may know better than me. But to me, it feels like the bishop is really strong on this d7 square, just monitoring all the dart squares around our dart squared pawn chain in the center. Kind of like how in a Caro Khan, you'll have pawn structure like this, and then a bishop on e7 monitoring the weaker dark squares. To me, it feels very similar. Okay. Bishop back to c2. Not c2, b3, although it may well go back to c2. C4 feels like a short-sighted move. There's no need. We're giving away the d4 square for no reason. So let's just go bishop d7. Something like rook e8, and we'll just continue. We have every advantage in this position. We have the bishop pair. We're up a pawn. White has an isolated d5 pawn. We have very good control of the center. We don't need to do anything insane. We just want to play normal moves, look for favorable trades, and most likely our bishop will be able to open up at some point in the future. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. And yeah, I think this series to me is quite interesting because I'm also learning the King's Indian as we play. Like, I don't know the King's Indian. This is me learning at the same time as you guys. Okay, queen c2. Very strange move. The only thing I can think that it does... Well, it unpins the knight, I suppose. Supports maybe bishop to b4. But does that not just lose a piece? After c4, bishop a4, and pawn b5? So as I mentioned earlier on... Let me find which position it was. It was after bishop to b3, I think. Yeah. I was considering pawn c4 in this position, as I said. But I was like, well, bishop c2, and I mean, why is my pawn on c4? I'm giving away the d4 square. Positionally, that is a bit silly. But now that queen c2 is played, we should still have this on our mind. It's a tempo move, so we should always be thinking, okay, can we play c4? Is it viable? Here, I think it is, because after c4, the bishop has to move, and then after pawn to b5, the bishop is lost. The queen is cutting off the retreat square. You know? We always need to consider attacking moves. You know, when you're looking at a position, any chess position, the first things you should be thinking are like, okay, are there any checks I can give? In this position, no, there's no checks we can give. Is there any free pieces that I can take? Well, this is the only piece I can actually see in the white territory, and it's certainly well defended, and I can see a2, but that's obviously very well defended, so I can't take any pieces. So then the next thing should be, okay, can I attack any pieces? And c4 is the most obvious way to do that. Okay, that's a nice counter shot from my opponent, pawn to f4, saying, okay, you're going to attack my bishop, well, I'm going to attack your knight. Why doesn't that work? Why doesn't that work? Well, okay, this is actually interesting, because after we take on b3, the queen is hanging, right? After pawn b3, if you take the knight, I take the queen, and I'm up a queen. Brilliant. However, after pawn takes bishop, there is a takes b3, hitting my queen, and then I have two pieces hanging. However, I can give a check on b6 or c5, right? Escaping the attack on my queen with tempo on the king. And after the king moves, I can move my knight away, and I'm up a piece. So let's take on b3. We need to do good calculation. But yeah, I mean, realistically, even if the queen wasn't hanging in this position, I would still make that trade. I would probably still make the trade, because after taking bishop takes, we would have the bishop pair against the knight pair, and the white king would have been weakened by playing f4, so it wouldn't be a big deal at all. So let's go queen to b6 check. Again, highlighting just how bad the loss of the dark squared bishop is for white, because there are dark squared weaknesses in the position. You know, the pawn structure that white constructed on move 5 is a light squared center. So trading off the dark squared bishop, who can play around the light squared center, is generally not a good way to go. In fairness, my knight is kind of trapped. My knight is trapped. It has no safe squares. But again, my knight is hanging, but can we attack something of higher value? Yes, we can. We can go queen to f5, hitting the white queen. And why is that important? Well, 1, it frees up the d7 square for my knight to drop back to. 2, we could even go into d3 if we wanted. And we can always hop back to c5. I'm skeptical about the move knight to d3, because g4, my bishop is under attack and my knight is under attack, and I can't go to e4 because the knight controls that square. So I'm also thinking of dropping the knight back to d7. However, again, we need to keep thinking and calculating. After knight back to d7 and pawn to g4, my bishop doesn't have any safe squares. So how do I deal with that? Good question. I'm not sure. Knight d3, pawn g4, knight takes b2. Oh, no. No, knight d3 does work. Knight d3 does work. Because after pawn g4, we have knight f2, and after rook takes, queen takes, and you take here, there's no way white has enough compensation. I'm up an exchange there, I think. So I think this is probably the best move. Hopefully that makes sense. I was also considering knight takes b2, as I mentioned. There's something like g4, knight takes b2, queen d2, maybe something like bishop takes followed by queen takes, I'm not sure. But I would at least be getting another pawn out of it. I was also half tempted to play pawn h5 in this position. And after you take my knight and I take back with the bishop, we are up a pawn. And again, we have the bishop pair. The white king is weak and the white pawns are weak. So that would have also been another way to handle the position. But as we're seeing, the King's Indian is definitely a tactical opening. There are lots of tactics involved in the King's Indian, so you need to be comfortable with navigating them. But also, it creates for interesting positions. It makes for interesting positions, which, obviously, I love the Karo Khan. I do quite like the Slav, but you could make the argument that it's slightly boring sometimes. You could make that argument. Okay, knight g3 is not concerning. What should we play? Well, we actually have a couple options. Knight takes b2 isn't ridiculous, because not only is the queen hanging, but the knight would also be hanging because we got rid of the defense. However, it seems to me to be far easier to just go knight to f2 check, forcing rook takes, because otherwise the queen hangs. After queen takes f2, knight takes f5, g takes f5. Our pawn structure kind of sucks, but we do control the e4 square, stopping the knight from getting into the game. We're up an exchange. We can always take... Wait. No, we're up a rook, aren't we? Oh, yeah, we're just up a whole rook. So, you know, our king is not under threat whatsoever. The only attacking piece that white would have would be the queen, which is obviously not enough. Anything else that white plays is not going to be sufficient in this position because we're just up an entire rook. And we're going to bring the rooks into the open e-file if we're allowed to do so. And it should be good. We can always take this knight, but not even necessary. Okay, queen h5 makes no threat. We don't need to be scared of it. We can just play queen b2. Doesn't matter if the f5 pawn hangs, because as in typical King's Indian fashion, the dark square diagonal from h8 to a1 is too weak. Is too weak. Which is something we always need to be on the lookout for in the King's Indian. My opponent will try to attack me with pawn g4, I assume. Or, okay, well, that doesn't make sense, because my opponent should be using the f-pawn as a hook to force open the g-file if he wants any chance of attacking me here. By taking here, how does he open up the g-file? He can't. Also, g4 would hang mate in 1. So, an understandable move, taking the free pawn. But white is down so much material that that should not be what he's trying in this position. He should be trying to just attack me and create some kind of perpetual check or something. Okay. Queen d7. Again, I don't care about the d6 pawn. I don't think. I mean, I could defend it. But I think it's far easier just to go rook e1 and force trades, because we are up so much material. So take, and then I think we have a very easy checkmate with bishop to d4. Queen to g4 doesn't come with a fork. And yeah, we have checkmate in a few moves. Not queen to g1, because the king can run to g3, and we'd still be completely winning. But bishop to g1 should be better, because our queen is covering the g3 square, forcing the king back to h1. And then, while we can win the queen with bishop to c5 discovered check, it would be more accurate just to go bishop to f2 check. And after the king moves, we can go queen to g1 because the bishop covers g3, and that is checkmate. So we can pre-move that because there's nothing white can do about it. The white king is surrounded. So my opponent resigns. Just to demonstrate, after king h1, bishop to f2 discovered check, king to h2. We could even play bishop to g3 checkmate, or queen to g1 checkmate. So yeah, GG to my opponent. Hope you guys enjoyed. Let's jump into the analysis and see what the computer has to say. Okay, so another very accurate game. 79.8% accuracy for my opponent, 94.2 for us. Let's jump into it. So we have a normal King's Indian setup, and then my opponent goes d5, which is a questionable move, to say the least. Normally, you'll have, like, knight c3, bishop g7, pawn e4, pawn d6, something like knight f3 and castles. This is a typical setup. But I think my opponent was trying to stop the possibility of pawn d5 in this position, the Grunfeld defense. I have played that in the past, and I kind of hate it. I'm not going to lie. I did not get on with it. It goes like this. Take, pawn e4, take, bishop to g7, and then you're looking for, like, c5, knight c6, queen a5, these kinds of moves. I never had success with it, though. So my opponent goes pawn d5, which stops that. But it's an overextension of the pawns in the center. There's no need to play that. So here we are basically equal on, like, move 3, which is great. So castles, pawn e4. Here, pawn d6 to stop pawn to e5. If we want it, like, you know, you may be tempted to go pawn to e6, immediately challenging white in the center. But then e5 comes with tempo on the knight, and I don't know, de6 we can't take because our queen hangs. And if we take back with the f-pawn, then the computer thinks we're in a lot of trouble. We're very suffocated here. So first we stop pawn to e5. Pawn h3, and then we challenge the center with pawn e6. And we're already better. We're already slightly better. Bishop g5 was interesting. If white were to take here, we could take with the f-pawn or the bishop. I preferred taking with the bishop because I wanted to use the open e-file against my opponent. So something like bishop e3, rook e8, bishop d3. Engine likes pawn c6, but let's just say knight c6, knight f3, knight h5 is possible, knight d7 is possible. We could even use e5 as a bit of an outpost. So let's say castles, knight de5, take, bishop e2. That hangs the c4 pawn. So, I don't know, b3 obviously opens this diagonal up, and white is in a lot of trouble. You can see how the overextension of pawn d5 is just not good. Because normally, when this pawn is on d4, so let me show you a normal line. So something like knight c3, bishop g7, pawn e4, pawn d6, knight f3, castles, bishop e2. We might go pawn e5 here. There are tactics if white plays take, take, and take. So if take, take, knight takes, we have knight takes on... Well, sorry. We can take here first. And after something like takes, 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 we win back the pawn. And we just have a better position. So you can't really take... So normally here, white will play a move like d5. That's what I'm trying to say. Where we have the same structure, but our pawn is already committed to e5, so we can't challenge with e6. And if we go pawn c6, and we take here, then after something like cd5, it's different. Our pawn would want to be back on e7 in this type of position, defending the d6 pawn, whereas it's already committed to e5 here, and d6 is quite weak, right? But by my opponent immediately committing to d5, it allows this structure, which is just good for us. It's just good. I thought he might play knight takes here, trying to go after our knight. And here, rook e8 is strong, c6 looking for queen a5 is strong, knight bd7 is strong. Lots of good moves for us. e4 is super weak, and we have the open e-file, and we control the e5 square in front of the pawn. It's a perfect setup, really. Takes back with a c-pawn. I thought taking back with the e-pawn made more sense. I know rook e8 check is going to happen, but at least the pawn on e4 isn't a weakness. Obviously, in the game, white lost this pawn very quickly. So I played pawn c5. The engine doesn't like pawn c5. It wants rook e8 immediately. And let's say bishop d3. Oh, whoa. Oh, I completely missed this because we can... Ah, right. The discovered check and the queen would hang. So you'd have to take this. And then there's queen g5. The knight is pinned. I completely missed that idea. I went c5. Which is inaccurate. And we do give the game back to white a little bit. But bishop c4 is just wrong. Okay. I thought something like knight f3 makes more sense, and I thought queen a5 was an interesting possibility. Rook e8 also makes sense. As something like bishop g to d3, we can go pawn c4. We can also play like knight bd7, and this is more of a Benoni structure. But bishop c4 is wrong. Queen a5 is inaccurate. Pawn h6 is stronger. And if the bishop retreats, rook e8. Okay. And yeah, e4 is weak for sure. Engine wants take, take, knight f3, queen f4, castles, take, take, and rook e4, and we're up a pawn. We do have to trade off our dark squared bishop, though. But here, my opponent blunders with knight to e2. Better would have been a move like bishop back to d2, which I did see was a possibility. But I thought after something like rook e8, we have to be positionally better, because e4 is just so hard to defend. And if white goes knight b5 with discoveries, we just drop back. And how are you defending e4? So knight e2, of course, blunders the pawn. And then we also win the bishop. And that, in some ways, is more important than actually winning the pawn, because our dark square bishop is completely uncontested. This does seem to be quite a good plan to develop. The engine also does like the a6, b5 idea, which I considered. Something like a6, let's say rook e1, b5, let's say bishop back to b3, bishop b7, knight g3, rook e8. We have the e5 square. We can also look for c4, knight c5 to go to d3 maybe. We have lots of options. But knight e5. Hitting the bishop, forcing the bishop back. Here, as I said, I didn't really like pawn c4. We're still better, don't get me wrong. b5, we can expand a bit. But our pawn is somewhat of a target, I would say. I think it's better on c5, because also we don't really want the knight coming into d4. So I went knight e5, and bishop d7, not the best move. Queen b4 is apparently stronger. I don't understand that. What's the point? Okay, well, there's no a3, obviously. And the bishop can't move because this hangs. So let's just say rook e1. What's the point? Engine wants to sacrifice the bishop. Oh, that's cool. I didn't even consider that. So bishop h3 would have been a move here as well? Okay, no, there's f4. Right. So why is it a move after queen here? If f4... Bishop h6. Okay. Queen moves. Bishop d7. And if takes, check here. And apparent... No, rook a over. And apparently we're winning. Okay. Okay. I mean, there's no need to do this, really. Just bishop d7 is fine by me. I wouldn't say this is inaccurate at all. Queen c2 obviously blunders c4, as we saw in the game. Pawn f4 is apparently the best move. Again, c4 is strong, hitting the bishop. If take, then cb3, ed6, ba2, rook a2, queen b6 check. And although these pawns look somewhat scary, we blockade them quite easily. And we're going to pick them off. I mean, this pawn is already lost if we want it. So let's say, like, if king h2, we take with check. If king h1, I mean, we can probably still just take it, to be honest. It's not the best move, but we could just take. Queen c2, though. And my opponent goes for this line. Now, of course, if my opponent goes bishop a4, we just go b5. If you try f4, now I can just go into d3, because this pawn is defending the knight. And it's not having to take the bishop. And then this would be very easy after something like take, 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 take. Everything is defended. b2 is lost. So, f4. We take on b3. Queen b6 first is also fine. A b3 and queen to b6 check. King moves. And here, as I said, I thought that even if we were to play a move like rook c8 and allow this, we're much better still. We're only at one pawn, but we have the bishop pair. The white king is weak, and the white pawns suck. They absolutely suck. So this would have been completely viable if you'd missed the bishop f5 idea. But bishop f5 is definitely the way to go. Knight d3, and both of these are very big targets. How do you deal with this position? As I said, pawn g4 was my first idea for white, and this is what I was trying to figure out. Because, of course, if I move my bishop, my knight is lost. If I were to have played knight back to d7, then after pawn to g4, my bishop is lost. Now, the engine says queen to e3, and after take here, knight f6, and I just have attacking ideas. I'm only at one pawn, but the white king is dead in the water. But knight d3 is easier, because if pawn to g4, I just go knight to f2 check, rook takes, queen takes, take and take, or queen f3 as well is perfectly fine. Bishop c3, pawn c3, rook yeah, I'm just dominating. But knight g3 chosen, force my opponent to give me the exchange, and now I'm just up a whole rook, because I, of course, won the bishop earlier on. And then the cleanup process is relatively easy. I just look to trade pieces as quickly as possible. Would have been slightly better, I think, to take on d6. Engine says mate in 8. There'll be some kind of checkmate. Yeah, again, same kind of idea that I wanted to go for. But rook e1, here, and again we go bishop to d4, looking for these checkmating ideas. And after bishop g1, white cannot escape checkmate. There are many different ways to do it, and all unavoidable. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a lot about the King's Indian, but also just chess in general. If you want to see the game that I was referencing earlier on in the video, which was like genuinely a stupidly accurate game, could not have played it better, then check out the video up here. And if you want to see the entire playlist of the King's Indian versus Everything series, check out the playlist down there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.